Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
Han Solo. I'm captain of the Millennium Falcon.
Run, Luke, run!
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Don't try to frighten us with your sorcerer's ways, Lord Vader.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
Do or do not. There is no try. No. I am your father.
Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi, with me, James.
And me, Matt. Every series on this podcast, we explore the world of science fiction cinema by taking a trip through a different subgenre of sci-fi.
This series, our journey is through the fantastical world of space opera. Well, it's finally the big episode, the episode that I have been dreaming about since we started this podcast. We are finally covering one of my favourite ever sci-fi franchises, the infamous, the amazing, the groundbreaking Star Wars. Are you as excited as me, Matt?
Very excited. It's the original trilogy, absolute classics of the genre. A bit of an elephant in the room for us. There's a few elephants in the room for this series, isn't there? There's a few big sci-fi films that we haven't covered yet because we haven't done the subgenre they fit into. And yeah, Star Wars has been sitting on the shelf, the old DVDs looking at me since we started this podcast.
I mean, we talked about Star Wars in our very first episode, didn't we? When we were talking about what actually sci-fi is and how we first got into science fiction. I know Star Wars was probably, well, it was one of the big ones for me and no doubt for yourself as well.
Me too, yeah. Star Wars, all three films taped off the TV by my dad sitting in our VHS cabinet. Got many a viewing, those original versions of those three films. Yeah, really, really beloved films of my childhood, definitely.
And the fact that Star Wars is so quintessential to this series as well, being space opera, it is the big groundbreaking space opera trilogy that went on to change the genre and change science fiction in so many ways as well, and even cinema. There's lots of things that happened afterwards in the industry that Star Wars was at the forefront of. And I mean, I'm already singing its praises. You can tell how this episode's going to go. It's going to be me loving off Star Wars for however long we're recording.
Yeah, Star Wars kind of feels like it sits in the very centre of the space opera genre. It's very clear what the influences were and how far they stretch back from before Star Wars. And there's huge influence of Star Wars on all cinema, but obviously very much in particular on the space opera genre after Star Wars. So it's sitting there right in the middle for me with everything that came before and everything that came after.
And in today's episode, we're going to look at the original trilogy, and we're not going to do deep dives as we do on some of the episodes. We're going to talk about the legacy of Star Wars and what each of these films did and what they offered, and talk about sort of the influences that they had on space opera. So it's going to be quite a broad conversation across this original trilogy today.
Yeah, one big film.
One big film in 3 parts, like a film serial, which we will get into. But first off, let's talk about our early memories of Star Wars and what the original trilogy sort of means to each of us then. We've already said that they were quintessential in our childhoods. So you taped them off the TV. Your dad had them. He already had that knowledge of Star Wars, and he sort of passed that down to you.
Yeah, my dad was a big tape stuff off TV guy, so he had a massive cabinet just full of VHS that he'd just tape films. That was how he kind of collected movies pre-DVDs existing. So yeah, I'd just get the Star Wars tape out. I don't remember watching Star Wars for the first time. I think I must have seen it when I was so young that my earliest memories of Star Wars are of being already familiar with Star Wars. So it really does feel like something I grew up with. In particular, I'd say the first one. I think I watched the first one way, way more than the other two. Just because if I was going to like pick up a film or put a film on, we'd start with the first one, and maybe we'd have the intention of watching the next two and then not get around to it, and then a few months later we'd start from the beginning again. So yeah, I've got vivid memories of like Tatooine, you know, watching the scenes with R2 and C-3PO in the desert and going to meet Obi-Wan and all of that. That's a very, very early memory for me. How about you? Do you remember the first time you saw them?
Yeah, quite vividly. So,
oh wow.
Well,
cool.
Primarily the first one that I watched, because I watched them all out of sequence. So we had a VHS copy of Return of the Jedi, and that was the only one we had. And we also had the Ewoks movie. So for me, Star Wars was just Ewoks when I was growing up.
Right.
And then it wasn't until, I think it was 97 when they did the re-releases in the cinemas. And George Lucas had gone in and added all the different special effects and things like that. And that's when I realized that it wasn't just this one film. Star Wars was an entire trilogy. And I got the whole box set for Christmas that year when it came out, the gold box set, which is just one of my fondest childhood memories, getting that for Christmas. And from then I was just obsessed. I wanted to get the toys when I could. I would sort of pretend to be a Jedi. It was just, having only grown up with Return of the Jedi, suddenly seeing that actually there's a whole backstory to what's going on with these characters, it just blew my mind.
What a strange way to watch it. But this is a strange franchise with a whole prequel series. So parts 4, 5, and 6 first, then parts 1, 2, 3, then parts 7, 8, 9. So I suppose in the grand scheme of things, there's nothing wrong with watching the original trilogy out of order in your youth as well.
Exactly. And I think this must happen to children growing up now, because the amount of Star Wars series and films that are out there, you can grab hold of this universe at any age and not really know how to navigate it. In the same way that you would have with the MCU now, Star Wars was kind of the original of that kind of film franchise, and just having this sprawling universe which fits so well in space opera, because space opera is all about the adventure and going to these different places and exploring the universe, flying around in your spaceship, space flowing through the ports like wine, as we've said before. It's all of this kind of really high fantasy kind of elements to it.
Yeah, and that sprawling universe has a fairly consistent, more consistent now since the Disney takeover, but fairly consistent linear timeline. So when you're talking about kids finding it now and jumping in at different points, every time there's a big new release, and I'm including the very recent TV series in that on Disney Plus, every time there's a big new release, it becomes a new point in the fictional timeline where a new viewer could potentially enter the series. And over the years, there were new entries into it, which meant that there was a new potential order you could watch things. Should I watch in the late 90s, early 2000s, should I watch them episode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or should I watch them release order 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, and then you get the sequel trilogy, and now you've got Mandalorian, Boba Fett taking place after the original trilogy. All these points where new viewers may potentially drop in and discover the universe, that I'd say it's probably getting harder to agree a definitive position. I think most purists will still just say you should watch the original trilogy first, but I think it's becoming more reasonable to say, like, oh, you happen to catch The Mandalorian on Disney Plus and you've never seen any other Star Wars stuff. That's great. Now you can go back and, find some other stuff you like.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think people get different entry points, don't they? But it is confusing, the timeline stuff now, because like you say, when you go in and watch The Mandalorian, it's in a slightly different time period. And you have to figure out where you are in the timeline of the universe in terms of the main storyline, which everybody knows, which is the Skywalker saga, the originals, where you've got this group of characters which become legendary in film and popular mythology almost, because there's a mythology around these characters and what's happening, which we'll get into later in the episode. But we should talk about George Lucas as a filmmaker first. So he's a filmmaker. He's also a businessman. He's got lots of strengths and weaknesses. I would say. But he's highly imaginative with this, creating this original trilogy of Star Wars. And it's so interesting looking at what he's gone on and done since.
Yeah, he's a very interesting filmmaker, isn't he? Because he's only made a handful of films and most of them are Star Wars films. So when you talk about like George Lucas's style, it's quite hard to pin down, really, isn't it? Because his style is Star Wars movies. That's the kind of film that he makes, basically. And we watched THX for our last series on dystopia. That was excellent. Have you seen American Graffiti? I haven't seen that.
Yeah,
one.
I watched it again recently, actually. It's a really good watch. It's a lot of fun.
And is there any kind of consistency in filmmaking across THX, American Graffiti, and then Star Wars?
I think it's more in the storytelling than anything, because American Graffiti, again, is like a coming-of-age tale, and Star Wars is very much that. And even THX, because it's coming of age in a way because of the way that the main character is finding out about his world and then going somewhere different. They're always there. They're always characters which are changing and going on to become something different and going somewhere to do something special.
Okay, that's an interesting way of looking at it, the kind of coming of age angle. And he's obviously got this interest in the hero's story kind of archetypes. I think he's a very good writer. He can be a very good writer. He's a very good storyteller and a world builder, but he's such a bad writer in terms of dialogue. We both watched a documentary called Empire of Dreams, an excellent documentary about this original trilogy, where Carrie Fisher says, you can write these words, but you can't say them, about the original script. And I did wonder how much of that is deliberate and how much that is he's just not very good at writing dialogue. I think he's admitted in more recent years that he's not a great writer of dialogue, but also there's something about the kind of hammy, cheesy 1930s stuff that he was trying to imitate, where they would talk in very overblown, theatrical, over-the-top ways. But I think it might be a little bit of both. Like, I think that just suits his writing style because he can't write very particularly realistic dialogue that I've seen. And
it's difficult as well because you are in this very unrealistic universe, aren't you, in Star Wars? You are flying around in spaceships and there's certain amounts of technology, and the way that you refer to different like alien planets and different alien races, the way you're talking about that, you have to create your own kind of dictionary for the world of Star Wars. And I think that's where that comes into play, doesn't it, with the dialogue, because they are having to say really ridiculous things and then trying to figure out how to say them in a believable way, where apparently George Lucas as well is like, he hasn't directed many of the Star Wars films. He directs this first one in 1977, and then we have different directors come on board for the next two in this original trilogy. It's been said on several occasions that he doesn't know, he's not very good at directing actors. He says what he wants and then just expects them to be able to do it. And that's a whole different talent as a director. But as a storyteller, you can see he's got this grand vision in his head, but it's difficult to articulate to other people if you haven't got the means to do it.
Yeah, but what's so interesting about that is that I think, particularly in the original trilogy, I think his awareness and acceptance of those facts about his skill set work to the credit of the trilogy, because then he gets different directors in to work on Empire and Return of the Jedi, in part because he found it too stressful, too much work directing the original film. And he was doing all of this stuff with Industrial Light and Magic and creating his whole business empire there, and working on the special effects side of things and also writing the movies. But then in those second film, in the second and third film, what you get is a much better performance from all of the actors. You see that evolution of the characters through the performances, and everything else is evolving visually and in terms of world building as well. So everything kind of comes together. So it's absolutely to the benefit of the films that he stepped away from directing so that those other directors can come in and get those performances. I'd say most crucially out of Mark Hamill. The evolution of Luke Skywalker as a character is brilliant across these three films. I'm not convinced, having seen the prequels directed by George Lucas, I'm not convinced that Lucas could have got that performance out of Hamill in Empire and Jedi. So it's absolutely to the credit of the films that he took that step back from the director's chair for two of them. But I strongly suspect he was way more involved in production than your standard screenwriter producer. I think he would have been there making comments, steering Kirshner and Marquand in the direction that he wanted the films to go in. Absolutely. I think he was doing a bit of directing, wasn't he?
Yeah, and you're right. The way that he is really getting stuck into the film as well, because it is his vision. It's his grand idea that he wants to get made. And 20th Century Fox were really doubtful about this project, weren't they? Because it was this crazy space opera. Even all the actors, they've talked about this on numerous occasions, especially in that documentary we watched, that they thought this was ridiculous. They couldn't see it being a big film, the first Star Wars film when it came out. They were like, it's fun, but it's ridiculous. Nobody's really going to get on board with this. They couldn't see what Lucas could see. And Lucas, of course, was basing this all off of his childhood and stuff like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, all of those space opera film serials which he grew up with, and what he wanted to do something along those lines, and he had that real passion for it. He was also really interested in stories like Robin Hood. Robin Hood gets brought up quite a lot when he references this, and then he's taking on the other influences that he's had as he's become a older filmmaker. So things like Akira Kurosawa, like Hidden Fortress is often compared to Star Wars, very similar, and I'm sure it's been cited as one of Lucas's influences. There's lots of stuff that he's drawing from in the same way that a lot of filmmakers get influences from various bits and pieces. He's trying to bring them all together to create this thing that hasn't really been done before.
Yeah, which is kind of a weird thing to do. Or not a weird thing. I mean, filmmakers are doing that all the time, but such a weird melting pot of ideas and influences that then goes on to basically shape cinema for the next 30 years and become, one of the most important cultural touchstones of all time. Incredibly weird that that's what it came from, and it was just all those influences. He just seemed to be the right person at the right time, didn't he? He was influenced by all the right things, went to the cinema and saw all just the right things that would create a new zeitgeist and resonate with just an unimaginable number of people.
And this was a time, so the 70s, like this comes out in 77. You've got so much turmoil in the world. You've got things like the Watergate scandal. You've got all of the stuff with Nixon that's happening at the time, Vietnam. You've got a very sort of, everything's quite high tension in the US particularly. Lucas comes around and says, I want to make a really optimistic science fiction, science fantasy film set. And it's just unheard of at the time. You've got the main science fiction films that have come out recently in these sort of like, if you look at 1977, are Planet of the Apes and 2001. Those were the big sci-fi films to come out. And they're very serious in what they're talking about and their themes and the way their approach to science fiction. Whereas this is so optimistic, and he's really telling a epic mythology as well. It's not just commenting on the zeitgeist. He's creating a proper escapist world for people to watch and get involved in.
Yeah, sci-fi's been getting steadily more serious since the films the serials that heavily influenced Lucas, and space opera, I guess, has been disappearing a little bit and not so much of interest to filmmakers. And then it all just gets reignited by this very light and unserious, thematically serious, but fantasy-based sci-fi movie that Lucas makes. And it's a shot in the arm to space opera for sure. And then we see it influencing films like we talked about, The Black Hole, which came after this, but was kind of, it was a more serious, cerebral sci-fi movie. And then they feel obliged to add in a load of wacky robots and, fun stuff, because Star Wars has changed the landscape of space opera so significantly. And
it wasn't just Star Wars. You were getting all of these young filmmakers coming up in the 70s, because all of the film companies were taking risks a bit more. They were like, we want to appeal to younger audiences. As we were talking about in Flash Gordon, they tried to, like with space opera, they were originally just trying to target young audiences, and then they wanted an older audience. And this was kind of they reverted in around the 70s. They wanted to go back and get younger audiences in the cinema, spending their money, and they were doing that by taking risks on these younger filmmakers. And people like Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, these names which now are just critically acclaimed directors that everybody knows about. If you love film, you know about these directors. But at the time, they were just all coming up with films at the same time and directing. And it just seems like a really exciting time to be in Hollywood. Steven Spielberg and George Lucas knew each other from film school. Imagine going to film school and then coming out and then being like, right, you're actually getting to make a film straight off the bat, and they're going to be some of the best films that cinema's ever seen.
Yeah, or imagine going to film school and coming out and then one of your classmates goes on to be Steven Spielberg and the other one goes on to be George Lucas.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's a few people which have been to film school which have experienced similar kind of things on different levels. But yeah, it's remarkable though, isn't it, that this was happening at the time?
Yeah, it's crazy to think all those guys were like mates. And obviously some of them became mates because they were colleagues. But, you know, Spielberg and Lucas being mates at university is an amazing sort of thought, isn't it?
Yeah, and just the idea that they carried on being mates during their filmmaking days. And there's a bit in the documentary where George Lucas talks about showing the first test screening to a bunch of his director mates like Brian De Palma and Steven Spielberg. What a group to show your film to. Like, if anyone's going to be critical, it's going to be them.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah, yeah. But Spielberg speaks so fondly of it, doesn't he? Spielberg always comes off well in interviews. He seems like a nice guy, and he's so sweet when he talks about George Lucas. Like, you can tell they're real old friends and really care about each other. Because anytime I see an interview or see Spielberg talking about Star Wars or Lucas, he just speaks so highly of him. He's just so nice about him. And one of the things about Lucas is that. Something I quite like about him is that he seems like an awkward nerd. And I think he always has been. I like the fact that an awkward nerd went on to create the biggest sci-fi franchise of all time. That feels appropriate. It feels good. I like that. It's good awkward nerd representation. But like, and there's a few other comments in that Empire of Dreams documentary about his kind of, the way he interacts with people. Harrison Ford says something like, he heavily caveats it. He's like, George is a really personable guy. George likes people, but... And then it's like a sort of a 5-minute sequence of the documentary talking about how basically difficult he found it working with actors and working with people on set and just getting on with people. And he's very stressed out as well, but I just don't think that's his skill. But, you know, he's well liked, even though he is, I think, quite an awkward guy around people. And Spielberg's just absolute love of him really speaks to that.
It was basically a children's film. You know, it wasn't what the other friends of mine would think of as something really worthwhile. Steven was the one person who was really enthusiastic about it and said, this is going to be a huge smash.
But George said, well, I think it's going to be a disaster. He was very depressed. And we all went to a Chinese restaurant after the film was over. And Brian stood up and started to geschrei about, what's going on around here? I don't understand the story. Who are these people? Who's the hairy guy? Where do they come from? Where's the context? Where's the backstory? It's driving me crazy. Brian went off on George. And George just sat there. He turned red. George, I think, wanted to kill him.
But there is just something about Star Wars that has made it have this grand legacy. And it's something about the space adventure itself. I was trying to think about the grand themes that are happening in this and why it is so exciting for audiences and just captures your imagination. What do you think are the sort of the key features of Star Wars that make it so engaging?
The morals of the story in the first film are so simple and black and white. The good versus evil story is incredibly simplistic, which is a very space opera thing to do that we looked at in Flash and Buck. And also that simplicity, that moral simplicity works very well for children. And we talked about how much it influenced us as children. And I would speculate that most people who really love Star Wars, the original trilogy, watched them when they were young and then grew up with them. And I think that simple morality in the first film, the good versus evil, is just something that kids can process very easily. That, you know, you don't necessarily have to have a concept of evil and what it means to be evil, but you know what a bad guy is in storytelling pretty quickly. You get why Darth Vader's a scary bad guy. We've got our other heroes standing in opposition to that. So I think that sits at the core of what makes it such an endearing story. And then what you get is sequels that expand on that and add complexity to that. So you're growing up with this story, and the story is growing up too, particularly in Empire. Famously, everything gets dark and gritty in Empire. Our clear-cut villain turns out to be a fallen hero, and it becomes like a redemption story. So it just builds on something very simple. You can latch onto the simple stuff and then enjoy all that building complexity to the story.
Yeah, and it's the simplicity that is, I think, is the key to this, because George Lucas talked a lot about Joseph Campbell and his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is one which I've read, and it's a really interesting book about storytelling and the way that mythology and stories in religion all sort of have the same key components. George Lucas really took on all of that stuff in making this story. So it's stuff like you've got the hero's journey going from this ordinary life with Luke Skywalker as this farm boy, suddenly going out into the galaxy and then fighting this evil empire and defeating evil and just going into the extraordinary. Suddenly there's stuff about like magic, that the Force is basically like magic, or some kind of religious sort of connotations in that as well. The good versus evil, and sort of all the powers that you get from being good and versus the ones you get from being evil, and all of that battling it out. That's something that happens in the hero's journey. And in the hero's journey, you've always got a mentor, an older mentor, who at the start of the trilogy is Obi-Wan Kenobi. And then after Obi-Wan Kenobi's death, you've got Yoda coming in afterwards, who takes the spot of that. And you've always got this old mentor guiding the young hero into doing what they must in order to save the day and then bring everything to right. So all of these elements are just something that happens in storytelling again and again. If you look at stuff like Beowulf and any old classic mythology, stuff like the Odyssey, it's in all of those stories. But what George Lucas did was he used all of those elements and then put them in this science fiction setting and made it extraordinary and made it something different. But he did it at that right time in the 70s when people wanted that escapist, but they also wanted a new mythology. And that's what he's done. And I think that's what the MCU does in a way as well, because they give a mythology to their characters. There's some extraordinary hero's journey, and that's what makes them so captivating.
Mythology is very important, I think, yeah, as well, definitely. I think audiences are always primed to accept a new mythology. I think they're always ready to accept a new mythology if that mythology is well fleshed out and believable on screen. We talked a little bit about this over on our Patreon channel when we were looking at Benson and Moorhead's films and how they're creating a new mythology. And you're right about the MCU. It very quickly established mythology and then it builds on it for 15, 20 years, whatever it's been now. I think audiences always want that because that's the essence of storytelling, isn't it? Like all religious texts are stories told using mythology and creating mythology that the audience is latched onto for, in some cases, thousands of years. So I think it's an inherent thing that audiences want. And if you can create a captivating myth, people will latch onto it. I think what's interesting about that in the terms of Star Wars is mythology can be shrouded in mystery, and then you project your own kind of ideas onto it as you're becoming interested in it. And then will audiences reject it if you then try to add more information and over-explain your mythology? Midichlorians and just over-explaining every kind of narrative choice that you made the first time and maybe undermining the imagination of your audience a little bit. Does that become an alienating thing in a mythology?
Yeah, and I think there's something about the way that George Lucas keeps going back to Star Wars and adding bits and taking bits away. You watch the films now and they've got sequences with different kinds of CGI in there. There's different voices dubbed over people like Boba Fett. You've got that just to make it seem like a cohesive piece when you add in the prequels. So you've got stuff like Hayden Christensen appears at the end of Return of the Jedi in these new sequences, whereas before it was the actor who'd played Darth Vader in those final sequences when he reaches his demise. And you watched a different kind of version, though, didn't you?
I've seen a version called, and Star Wars fans will be aware of this, called Harmy's Despecialized Editions, and that's a fan edit using, I think it uses the Laserdisc releases from the 90s, so the kind of highest quality releases prior to the digital re-editing and re-releasing of the films in the late 90s, and trying to upscale them and turn them into high quality, high definition releases of the original films, which don't exist officially through any official channels, either Lucasfilm or Disney. And Harmy's like the nickname of the guy. It's a Polish guy whose surname shortens to Harmy, and he's referred to all of those re-releases in the digital editing as an act of cultural vandalism, which is quite a dramatic
strong,
term. Yeah, quite strong, but I do get what he means. And when you're thinking about it in terms of creating a mythology that people become interested in, if you retroactively edit that mythology, I can see how some people would consider that cultural vandalism if you're a big fan of that. I mean, I've watched them. They are amazing. Just the technical achievement of them, that this was done by quote unquote amateurs. It certainly doesn't look like an amateur production. It's incredible. And I'd highly recommend it if you've got the DVDs and you're wanting to see that original version, or if you've got the Blu-rays rather. Yeah, it's an incredible piece of work. I'm baffled. I understand why George Lucas never released high definition versions of the originals when he was in charge and when it was a Lucasfilm property. But I'm sort of baffled that Disney haven't done it since they've taken over, because they'd make a buck on it. That's what they want, right? Like, they'd make a lot of money, I think, if they released a new version that included an unaltered original version. So I'm baffled as to why they haven't, and I expect that in the full course of time, we will see that coming out of Disney eventually.
Oh, no doubt. You can definitely see it coming. But you talking about the cultural vandalism of it and the way they tweaked certain bits and added new bits in, it reminded me of a story that you told me about what became canon and what has been taken out of the Star Wars story. So stuff like in the comics, they carried on the story in the comics. I mean, very early on, Star Wars got a deal with Marvel, and they were putting out comics and lots of literature on top of the films to try and build up hype.
Before even the first film, I think, right?
Yeah, just to build up that hype. And they were doing lots of clever things like going to Comic-Con early and trying to really hype up this first film, going to try and find the sci-fi nerds like ourselves, go and grab us.
Just to find an audience.
Yeah, exactly. Because they thought it was going to be this small audience which would gravitate towards it. But going back to the canon stuff, there was a story in one of the comics or one of the books or something like that where Chewbacca is killed by a planet or like a meteorite, and they kill him off. But then, of course, they have to retroactively get rid of that because he then later appears in the new trilogy, the latest trilogy.
Yeah, I heard, I don't know how true this is or just rumour or if I've misremembered or whatever, but I've heard that was that was a relatively big factor in Disney basically pulling the plug on all of that expanded universe stuff, or at least like it was a big question mark for the Force Awakens before it came out, because to fans in 2014 and prior, when the film had been announced, Chewbacca was dead. Yeah. Chewbacca was dead in the universe and he wouldn't be in the film. So they had to make a decision there on that. I'm sure a lot of other stuff went into it because there was 30 some years of unbelievably convoluted plot lines and stories taking place after Return of the Jedi. And then you're plopping your filmmakers in there and saying, right, we want a new movie set after Return of the Jedi. It would be impossible to navigate. It's still a weird thing to do, though. I never got into any of that expanded universe stuff, but that's where the majority of Star Wars fans kind of existed prior to 2015. And it's just a huge amount of story that people were very invested in. And then Disney buy the company and say none of that stuff exists anymore. It's like I would have been quite upset if I was.
I've spent years getting to grips with this universe and I know this about it, and then suddenly you're pulling the rug from under me and I don't know where I am anymore.
They call it Legends now, I think. So it's still sort of an ongoing. I don't know if anyone's writing new stories in the Legends universe or Legends canon, but it's got its place. It's not quite brushed under the carpet, but it sort of is, isn't it?
Yeah. By switching all of the stuff that's canon and not canon, you do kind of make it a bit convoluted. But the thing is, George Lucas is doing such a massive, massive thing with creating this universe, and it does become bigger and bigger. I mean, he always wanted it to be more than just one story from the sounds of it. He didn't know if he would get the opportunity to make more Star Wars films, but he had ideas. And this is the thing, if you're sitting with an idea like that for so long, you must start be thinking about what would happen here and what would happen there. In a similar way to now we've got James Cameron doing the Avatar films, and we've already heard that he created an entire backstory, wrote an entire script of what happened in between the first and the second film. So creating that universe is something which takes a lot of time, but world building in Star Wars is so huge, it's hard to get to grips with it. But essentially, in these first few films, you've got certain distinct groups and we've got very distinct planets that we visit. So what do you think about the groups that we see in Star Wars, and what are the different groups that we see?
The main ones are the Empire and the Rebels, obviously. There is this sense of lots of characters who are neither. And there's lots of stories to be told in that space, which Lucas, I feel like, never really got to in his time at the helm, and now that's where Disney's picking up and exploring. But you've got these two very distinct. The black and white good and evil of it is the rebel heroes and the evil empire. The evil empire, I think, even described as an evil empire in the opening crawl, right? So it's like from the drop. There really are no questions asked here. Like, these are not shades of grey bad guys. They're pure evil. Don't worry when they die. Don't worry when stormtroopers die. They're literally all of them are bad. But there is this colourful cast of weird looking aliens everywhere they go, particularly Tatooine and Mos Eisley, that hints at the enormity of the universe, because most of the heroes are human, whatever that species is in Star Wars that looks like humans. I don't know what they're supposed to be, actually. I assume they're just called humans.
They're probably just whatever planet they're from, because I know in Andor there's a specific planet this guy's from, so he's... But humanoid, okay. There's Corellian or something like that.
There's a lot of Corellians going around. I think Han Solo's a Corellian.
I mean, that's the thing, though. There's a lot of humanoids creatures in this universe, but you're mixing them in with these crazy exotic looking creatures which just get more and more crazy to look at, but they really bring a sense of this is another planet, this is a different galaxy that we're in.
And the enormity of the galaxy as well, or the fictional universe, is incredibly biologically diverse, so it must be quite sprawling and huge and technologically advanced as well, that all these sentient races are gathering in a wretched hive of scum and villainy in Mos Eisley. It must be incredibly futuristic, but you get that sense of the galaxy being very far away from this diverse range of aliens that we see. And that feels like that's George Lucas's vision. And I also, we were talking about the re-releasing and the re-editing. I'm very, I don't like them. I don't like the re-releases at all. I think they're very ugly. But I do get what George Lucas was thinking, and you can see in the documentary that we watched, you can see the behind the scenes footage of George Lucas, and you hear how frustrated he was with things not quite looking how he wanted, and he had such a clear vision, and they just didn't have the budget and or the technology to make that exist on the screen. So he's looking at some fuzzy alien in the cantina and being like, that guy doesn't exist in my universe. Why is he on set? I can understand that. I just think the execution of trying to digitally create whatever his vision actually was looks insane and weird.
Yeah, and he got proper art commissioned for the inception of the idea, didn't he? And a lot of that art influenced everything. Even the actors, they were kind of creating their personas, especially C-3PO. Anthony Daniels, he very famously has said about looking at a picture of C-3PO that was hanging above George Lucas in one of the script reads or something like that. And then he suddenly had an idea of how to portray this character. And without those big illustrations and storyboards and pictures and also for him to explain this kind of bonkers stuff to any production company or any actor, anybody working on the film, it's a lot to try and take in when there's no basis for this. Like we said before, the closest things that people have are 2001 and Planet of the Apes in a cinema sense. So they're having to properly invent these worlds and figure out ways they can get them on screen and create this new technology. It's all, you can see why George Lucas almost had a mental breakdown trying to make these films.
And again, it's another thing where that's become the norm in filmmaking now. Like the actors stand in front of a green screen and can't see any of the other characters or sets that they're interacting with, and that's a completely normal acting experience. But it wasn't in 1977. It's another legacy of Star Wars thing, and that artwork that you're talking about, that Ralph McQuarrie artwork, is beautiful. If you've never seen that, listeners, I'm sure most of our listeners have seen stuff like that. But just Google Ralph McQuarrie Star Wars art, or just Ralph McQuarrie art, because his art is really gorgeous 60s and 70s style, old school sci-fi artwork. It looks amazing. And it's another good example of George Lucas working with his collaborators. So like we were saying, with where he brings in directors in the second and third film and allows them to take over to the benefit of the films. It's also just in all the pre-production, he's working with all these talented artists and prop makers and puppeteers to... He's got a very clear vision, but he knows how to delegate it out and find the right talent to bring his vision to life in a way that then goes on to have another generation of inspiration. Like what you were saying, Anthony Daniels, taking his performance in part from how C-3PO is written by George Lucas, but also in part from Ralph McQuarrie's art, which is taken from Lucas's vision. So everything just goes down this kind of chain of influence through the artists and professionals that work with him, and he makes this amazing film. And then he comes to make part two, and all of those people getting commissioned know exactly what it looks like because they've seen episode 4. Episode 4.
You have to be careful with those, don't you? And that chain of inspiration that you were mentioning about, that sort of the connections that you see. One of the interesting parts of this is Industrial Light and Magic, the company which George Lucas created to do all of these special effects. George Lucas showed those guys old footage from old war films of dogfights in the air, and that helped to give them an idea of how to shoot and create these moments in space and how to make that realistic and make it feel like it's a proper dogfight in space. You've got these spaceships firing lasers at each other. How the hell are you going to do that if you've got nothing to base that on? So they're creating all of these shots, they're basically shot for shot recreations of some old war films.
Yeah, I think you can create that. You can create that from scratch, and filmmakers were doing that and can do that. But it's about turning it into something that looks kinetic and real and feels real is so important for just making it feel like a timeless film and making it look basically good. And that's what they succeed at.
Because what's the thing that George Lucas is famous for saying? Like, do it faster and more intense. Just, yeah. Everything has to be faster because it's going a mile a minute in this galaxy. The action scenes have to be quicker. Everything just has to be more dramatic, more adventure. And again, that makes me think of Flash Gordon, because in so many scenes in that 1930s film serial that we watched, it's Flash fighting a alien bear or a tiger or something like that, and it's got to be dramatic and it's got to be fast paced, and they had so many problems with editing as well with these films. Like they initially cut it as you would do shot for shot, this is what's happening, And then they had to get different editors in to try and recut it in a different way and make it more kinetic and more fast-paced. And if Star Wars didn't have any of that, it would just lose all of the pacing, and it would have become just... I think it would have looked more silly if it hadn't have been treated in the way that it has. You've got all this exciting moments and this sense of adventure that comes from the way that they've shot it and cut it. If they had just done these scenes with some of the dialogue in a slower way, it just wouldn't have the same bite.
Yeah, the film kind of comes alive in the post-production, I think, doesn't it? I mean, there's some amazing performances in that first film, but the editing, like you're saying, is good and brings it to life. And also the sound design and the musical score are so important to the character of the film. It's Ben Burtt, isn't it? Who we've talked about Ben Burtt before, because when you hear the name Ben Burtt, you think R2-D2. When I hear the name Ben Burtt, I think Wall-E. But what a career to be working in, to have vocalized both of those iconic robots. But his work overall, kind of on the sound design of Star Wars, I assume includes a lot of the whooshes and zooms of Star Wars.
Yeah.
But the whooshes and zooms of Star Wars are some of the most iconic noises in cinema, aren't they? The lightsaber, the TIE fighter and X-Wing swooping noises that they make. It's such an important part of it. The blaster noises are so great. Han Solo's blaster in particular.
Oh, everything. Just the way they've brought all of these characters alive and made them seem like these exotic alien creatures, but the way that they've used these sounds which we know. So like when they do the blasters and stuff, they've used like weird synthesizers, and it's like natural sounds and like pinging on metal wires and things like that in order to create these outer worldly sounds for the equipment. But then also the way that they've created sounds for the creatures, like you said, R2-D2 is beeps and bops, and it's made to sound like sort of baby talk as well. So it's got that characteristic to R2-D2. R2-D2 being a small droid, the way that he's communicating is all very carefully thought out. And as with Chewbacca's voice is a culmination of dogs and tigers and bears and all these different animal sounds put together to create this kind of emotion that's happening in Chewbacca. And also, I didn't realize that the guy playing Chewbacca, Peter Mayhew, he's doing the actual lines in the film, and they've dubbed over him. It's mad, isn't it? I only found this out recently.
It's very funny to watch behind the scenes footage and see Chewbacca saying like, "Oh, I don't like this Darth Vader guy." And then Han Solo's like, "Oh, you said it, Chewie."
Yeah, and they've done so many clever things with doing that, and just...
But specifically Peter Mayhew's like, "Oh, you don't like this Darth Vader guy."
Yeah, because he was like an orderly before that, and he
was just...
they wanted someone who was 7 foot or however tall he is, someone imposing to play Chewbacca. This guy wanders in, and he's like, "Yeah, he's perfect."
You'll do, yeah. Incredible. Like, he must be so rich just off the back of being just the right height to play Chewbacca. Good on him.
All right, don't lose your temper. I'll come right back and give you a hand. What? Where the hell have you been? All right, don't lose your temper. I'll come right back and give you a hand. We going? To make my report. Tell him we're leaving then. All right, I'll tell him.
Hi, listeners. If you're enjoying the show and want to support what we do, you can sign up to our Patreon by going to patreon.com/Journey Through Sci-Fi.
And if you subscribe at the warp speed level, you'll get access to our regular bonus episodes, as well as the whole back catalogue.
We've got a host of mini-series like deep dives into the Terminator and Planet of the Apes franchises, as well as the Bad Movie Bunker and reviews of the latest sci-fi films.
Plus, you'll get a say in the kind of content we make for our patrons.
We hope to see you there.
I'm a member of the Imperial Senate on a diplomatic...
You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor. Take her away.
I'm a member of the Imperial Senate on a diplomatic mission to Alderaan.
You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor. Take her away.
To go back briefly to the idea of the voices, the fact that Darth Vader's voice wasn't David Prowse. It wasn't him. It was James L. Jones who did the voice for that character in the end, because they were like, right, we need a really imposing, deep voice for Darth Vader. James Earl Jones's voice is just so beautiful to listen to. But then adding all the sort of scuba diving regulator sounds to it, making it different. And this is dubbing actors done well, because when we looked at Kroll, it was a different kind of dubbing. It felt a bit off, didn't it? Because you've got, why did you need to do it in that instance? But with Star Wars, it's so critical to those characters like Darth Vader and Chewbacca, and even giving R2-D2 a voice. All of it makes the film.
It's to do with not seeing their face, I think, isn't it? None of the characters whose faces we see are dubbed, I think, are they? But it's all the characters. There's characters who either don't have faces in a traditional sense, in the case of R2-D2, or their faces are, the human actor face is obscured, or it's just a helmet like Darth Vader. Then the characters are kind of pieced together in bits and bobs. So you've got the right performer inside, again, for Lucas's vision of what this character will be like, a big Wookiee. So we need a big man inside. But then Peter Mayhew's voice is not part of that vision. So we're going to construct that separately and use leopards and wolves and all that as influence, and create something outside of the human actor playing it. So the dubbing just becomes an element of constructing a fictional character in that sense. And
also the fact that they've got human actors in some of the droids as well. Like we talked about C-3PO, but Kenny Baker is in that R2-D2 costume through a lot of it.
Yeah.
And that's just crazy as well, to think that that's how they had to do it, because that's the only way you could feasibly do it on screen. But Kenny Baker does a remarkable job going around in that droid and then still giving it the kind of the movement that that the droid is doing, like the changing of its heads and sort of the way that everything's coming in. It just, I don't know how we managed to get that much across just from waddling around in that suit.
Yeah. Yeah, R2-D2's a very expressive character. We talked about the black hole and how those droids or robots were trying to imitate Star Wars success, but I don't think they quite capture it in the same way, because because they're not as well thought through, I think, as R2-D2 as a character, or just all the characters, I guess, in the universe of Star Wars. You feel the way that they feel tacked on in the black hole, and I think that's where the difference is. And you're right, Kenny Baker's great. All of the droid acting and puppeteering acting across all of the films, not puppeteering acting, sorry, puppeteering, is amazing. And they just got the best of the best. Like, I mean, they've got Frank Oz in, who has to be one of the greatest puppet performers and voice actors of all time, to play the most important puppet in the series, to operate, rather, the most important puppet in the series, Yoda. I love Frank Oz. He's created so many iconic characters. I love the Muppets, and those characters are obviously inherently funny and silly. But Frank Oz is he's like a thespian of the puppeteering world. He takes it so seriously. Yoda's kind of a silly character as well, but he's so in the role and so serious about it. I just love hearing him talk about it, because he just talks so seriously. Like, this guy's Miss Piggy and he's like talking like an old thespian. I just love him. He's such a great guy.
You're right about Yoda though, because that could have gone horribly. You've got this weird little gremlin looking character, but then he becomes so iconic, doesn't he? The way that Yoda talks, and the fact that he makes an appearance in the prequels, and now you've got Grogu, which is sort of basically baby Yoda in The Mandalorian. It's become so iconic, but it could have just been like this entire film franchise. It could have just been like, this is silly, it doesn't work. But because of all of the detail in making you like these characters and this cast, and it's also carefully curated, you believe it. And let's talk about the rest of the cast then. So we've got this really quintessential trio throughout the trilogy. You've got Luke, Han, and Leia. What are your thoughts on these guys?
Something that I was noticing watching the films back for recording today was that I think that Leia and Han Solo are really fully formed characters at the very beginning of the first film. And I don't think they have much of a character development journey throughout this trilogy. They have a romance story between the two of them that develops over the films, but that's not really character development, I wouldn't say, for them. But I don't think that's a problem because, as I was saying earlier about Mark Hamill's performance of Luke, Luke's character development is so good across the three films that he is the main character. It is sort of a trio of main characters, and I find it interesting that their names come up at the end of the film all in one go, all three of them, like they're getting triple billing. But Luke, it's called the Skywalker Saga, retroactively it's called the Skywalker Saga. It's clear to everyone that Luke's the main character, right? And Hamill is the one who goes on this amazing performance journey. So it's not a problem that Leia and Han Solo don't really have any character development. And I quite like the fact that they just kind of arrive in those first scenes fully formed and don't change as people, because it makes them feel quite real, doesn't it? It's just like, this is, Han Solo's had an absolutely crazy life, and the three films that we watch him in, that's just one chapter of his crazy life as a smuggler, like, and that's what it feels like. And Leia's a senator and princess, so she's, she's lived an incredibly exciting and interesting life as well. But these films are the biggest thing that have ever happened to Luke Skywalker, so we go on that journey with him. That's why I think they work so well. I think it's really Luke's character development that drives it all, and then you've got two really great characters supporting him and going on the journey with him, and more than two, but in three. You're
right, though. They are fully formed characters as soon as you see them with Han and Leia, because they are who they are, and you accept that. But I think they're played so well throughout that they were really paying attention to what would work and what's believable of these characters being who they are. So Han doesn't change. You find out more about him in terms of he warms up as the film trilogy progresses, and you do see this love relationship, like you mentioned, between him and Leia. But that is all, it's done in a very careful way. They don't just make it a smoochy love story straight off the bat. They really have to work at it and sort of show these characters and how they respond to each other. And it makes it more realistic, because it's not instant love at first sight. It's Han sort of being his smug but charming self, and then Leia slowly letting her walls down a bit and being like, actually, I do quite like this guy who's a bit of a jerk, but there's something about him.
Yeah, and those things work because, as you say, they're fully formed, and you believe what they're going through, because they just feel like fully formed characters, and it's very good, confident performances from Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford. I mean, Harrison Ford obviously just like oozes confidence in every role. That's his whole thing. But it was also interesting that because he got the part by essentially helping that when they were auditioning. George Lucas didn't want him to be in it because he'd been in American Graffiti for whatever reason, some weird George Lucas rule. But he did get him in to just read lines. But then it just becomes like this massively unfair advantage to Harrison Ford, because he's got more experience of reading lines for Star Wars than anybody else on the planet, because he's just sitting there reading it for everyone else auditioning. So he just develops this, he's got his own natural charm and confidence as a person and as an actor, and then he's got all this confidence of fully understanding what's going on in the story and all the characters. So he's just a natural. And obviously Carrie Fisher's just exudes charm. She's such a effusive, funny person in real life, a funny and confident person as well. Although it sounds like she had a lot of pretty horrible emotional baggage, especially around the time of making these films, but she certainly had that confidence and bright personality that she can just step into Leia and bring Leia to life in a way that makes Leia interesting and likable, and not not boring, which I think she could have been.
And they're all just having fun with it. You can see it on screen that they're just really enjoying themselves and just totally along for the ride on this crazy adventure that's happening.
But presumably, like, that's because they think the movie sucks, right? I think there's an element of like, no one knows what's going on apart from George Lucas, really, on the first film. He's the one with the vision, and he's communicating it out in just the right way to get what he needs out of everybody who works on it. But everybody working on it thinks this is going to bomb. This is a ludicrous film. So for the actors, it's just a silly bit of fun. You know, they're getting paid. Yeah. And then maybe they come back for Empire and Jedi and they've formed bonds and they've seen how good the film can be. So they're taking it more seriously in their performance, but they're still able to have fun because they're working with friends from the last film, you know. But I think that first time, a lot of that fun is just, I don't know, working on a very silly movie from their perspective.
Yeah, and you do kind of feel that in the performances as it goes on, because Empire is, like you said before, so much darker, and you've got more dramatic stuff happening in the film, in the story, and all of that really contributes it to being such a great second act of the film, because it's a good way to look at it as it's a 3-act film. Like I said, it's one big film when you look at it that way. In the same way that the film serials work on cliffhangers, Empire Strikes Back has the best cliffhanger, the best plot twist of any film. It's so amazing. And the fact that they kept that a secret, even from the actors on set, until the very last moment when they told Mark Hamill what was really going to be said at the moment that he's on the pillar and he finds out that Darth Vader is in fact his father. What an amazing twist. And just bits like that. It's just, they kept innovating it in a way that makes it more engaging, because the second film could have been a rehash of the first one in the same way that the later trilogy kind of rehashes the other trilogy in a lot of ways. But it does something different, and it does something different Return of the Jedi as well. Not just in the story, but also in sort of where they're visiting. Everything's quite stylized. You've got Hoth, this ice planet. You've got Tatooine, this desert planet. You've got the forest planet of Endor. Everything has a distinct place and feel and makes it like, so you identified that film with that setting, and that adds something.
Yeah, yes. Every film has a distinct temperature, doesn't it? Like a climate. But and I completely agree that those 3 climates are desert, ice, forest. But each of those films has loads of other locations as well, and that's a really important like space opera trope, is that it's taking us through fantastical environments just bit by bit. We saw it in Barbarella, we saw it in the film serials, where that episodic feeling of moving from one exciting location to another, I feel like the first one has the fewest, because it's mainly Tatooine, Mos Eisley, which is on Tatooine but feels like a distinct location to the desert, and then mostly Death Star,
space fights,
and then Rebel Base, and mostly in space. Empire has more, and then Jedi has more.
Cloud City and a return to Tatooine in Return of the Jedi as well, which is nice.
Return to Tatooine, but a completely different Tatooine. Now it's Jabba's palace, which is a whole new set. So we're always moving through new locations, exciting new sets and places to set the action in. That's a very space opera trope. And also very important in the Star Wars films for what you were saying, not rehashing what's come before. So I think possibly the ice setting may have been like a deliberate choice to be as far away from the intro of Star Wars, which is in a sandy desert on Tatooine. So let's go cold.
Let's pick the worst places to try and film our scenes.
Yeah, a little overly ambitious there. But yeah, it's that combination of like not repeating things and also space opera tropes to create excitement and diverse visual scenes. But even within that, I was amazed by how well it all hangs together as the same fictional universe. So even though we're in an icy cave or a dusty cantina or a forest moon, I think it's the work of Industrial Light and Magic, the consistency of special effects under George Lucas's sort of supervision. There's no moment where you don't feel like you're in the Star Wars universe, where we've shifted to a different setting even though everything looks completely different. Do you know what I mean?
It's very cohesive, isn't it? It's everything's got a relation to each other. Like you've got similar feels about places in terms of sort of like the technology they might use, but it's all quite inventive. There's a different spin on it depending on what planet you're from. Like you might be riding on one of those, I don't know what they're called, in the planet of Hoth. They've got like Tauntauns. So they're riding around in Tauntauns there, whereas they might be in a sand speeder in Tatooine, or on one of those other speeders on Endor. There's a different mode of transportation as well, and all of this stuff but they feel connected.
Yeah. Because it's one big empire that's taken over this whole galaxy, or most of this galaxy. So it's all kind of connected through the empire. Although, I don't know, it feels like the culture of this galaxy extends beyond the empire's reach, or, because everyone's a rebel anyway. And for me, that is a big part, I think, now that I'm thinking about it, I think that's a big part of why I don't like the special editions, the re-releases, because all of that CGI stuff just looks completely different. And any scene where there's a big CGI dinosaur type thing in Mos Eisley, that to me looks like it's not part of the Star Wars universe, because it just has a different visual feel. And those are the moments where I'm like, well, now I'm not sure what fictional universe I'm in, or it just doesn't feel that cohesion has been drawn over, basically.
And I know some people who aren't particularly into cinema find it difficult to see the Star Wars trilogy in a different way, in terms of, so you've got the original trilogy, it's in the 70s. It's very clearly in the 70s just because of the way everybody looks, certain ways like hairstylings, things like that. And because it's an older film, sometimes people find that harder to make it as this cohesive piece, where you've got the prequel trilogy being filmed in the future, basically. And then you've got the other trilogy happening afterwards. And it's, I don't know, part of that can be a disconnect for people.
Yeah, basically the film set in the past look like it's set in the future.
You don't need to do it. Yeah. But what also really brings it together is John Williams' brilliant score. So at the time, again, thinking of 70s films, a lot of the scores were, disco is like a popular music genre at the time. A lot of film soundtracks are going for that kind of feel. But John Williams, being a classical composer, he brings in this proper filmic music, which hadn't been seen a lot at the time from young filmmakers. George Lucas being a very young filmmaker at the time of making this. He's bringing all of this wealth to it. And again, it's harking back to stuff like Flash Gordon with the film scores, what you would have in those old black and white films. It just brings with it such a oomph. And those scores are just, they stick in your head. They're earworms, but they're also so synonymous with this franchise.
I feel like it's fairly early. I think he was working, but when we talk about John Williams and we talk about all the iconic soundtracks that he made, I think he would have done Jaws at this point, but he's yet to do Indiana Jones, obviously, and Superman, I think, will be coming out after this. So this is, and even Jaws. Jaws is iconic, but it's not, the most iconic bit is just that kind of rhythmic, which isn't that musical. It's much more, almost more of a sound effect in how it's used in that film. But this is music. This is orchestral music, iconic scoring. So I think it's definitely his first really iconic score that I'm aware of. I might be wrong on the timeline, but
it adds a real sense of gravitas to this otherwise ridiculous sounding and looking film. By having such a powerful score, it makes it it gives it more sort of a legitimacy, I feel, because if they had loads of synths and things like that, it wouldn't have aged as well. It wouldn't have had that timeless feel to it.
Definitely.
So I think all of that is so important into why these films have lasted and continue to spawn sequels and TV shows and whatnot.
Yeah, soundtracks and scores date a film. I think it's between using modern technology and the soundtrack and the score that you use on your film are the two things that date it the most. And maybe, I guess, hairstyles. But classical orchestrated music on a film will never go out of fashion. It's the genes of film music, isn't it? It's always in fashion. It's always going to be good, and it's always going to look timeless. And Lucas is, I don't know. I was going to say Lucas is aware of that, but I'm sure he's aware of it now. But yeah, it was more about harking back to what he liked earlier rather than trying to make something timeless. I think that's the impression that I get.
Yeah, a lot of it is kind of borrowing from the past. But at the same time, when he's making these films, he's doing some really revolutionary stuff in terms of filmmaking. So he starts off with this partnership with the film company, and then he says with Empire Strikes Back, right, I'm going to make it myself. I'm going to put my own money into it. I'm going to do it independently in that respect, which is absolutely crazy. Like the amount that he put in, there was no guarantees it was going to be a success. He'd already signed, like in the first film, he'd made sure that he owned the rights to merchandising. He'd got that deal with Kenner. Nobody realized how popular this film was going to be.
Do you think he just got lucky there? Do you think he knew that it was? No, he did. He couldn't have known that it was going to sell the toys.
There's no way he would have known, but he had the kind of confidence in it. Because if you think about it, stuff like Buck Rogers was selling toys, and he's basically creating his own Buck Rogers. If it really takes off, he knows that there's money in that. Like, it was so successful, the toy merchandising, that what would they do? And they were giving out tickets to get your toy in March when it was supposed to be out in December.
For Christmas,
yeah,
as a Christmas present. Yeah. Kenner couldn't keep up with the demand.
Yeah, and they were just like this little toy company which had managed to get the rights to it. And then, like we said before, it just went on and on and on. I think Planet of the Apes had a similar thing in terms of merchandising previously. So maybe that was kind of the template that Lucas was looking at. But again, the merchandising aspect of it, how it's going to make the money other than just the film tickets, and just looking at it as a brand, and then going off as well and then making Skywalker Ranch and having this whole independent film company himself, creating these new technologies, creating digital editing, the first digital editing computers, creating Pixar, all of these things that Star Wars basically is responsible for. It's mad because it makes you think like, okay, George Lucas may not be the best director, but there's so many aspects to filmmaking that he just knows about and wants to get right.
Yeah, I think he found his lane after Star Wars, which is on the technical side of film production. He's clearly excellent at it. And it's interesting that he seems like he was a fairly anti-establishment person in the early stages of his career. And then he essentially goes on to create his own filmmaking empire or film production empire. It seems like he just creates his own, he becomes part of the establishment or just creates his own establishment. It's just it's a strange trajectory, but it seems like he found his niche. He found what he was good at, and he is excellent at it. And then he just, seemed. I mean, what was he working on? He obviously worked on Raiders. He worked on the Indiana Jones films post Star Wars, but it feels like most of his work was kind of more on the technical side.
Yeah, and then he did the technical stuff for Jurassic Park, and that was when I think
was it?
Yeah, and then seeing the special effects for that made him want to revisit Star Wars again.
And that is weird, right? Because he's gone from being someone who maybe recognised that he wasn't that great at directing actors, but good at world building and good at production, and then decides he wants to be an auteur in the late 90s and becomes an auteur and makes 3 films, writing, directing and having enormous amounts of control over. And they're just not very good.
Yeah.
So it seems like he learned what he was good at and then unlearned it. And
but it's like at that point, how much input can other people have into Lucas's vision? Whereas before in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, he's getting these directors to really help guide him. I mean, he wanted to get Steven Spielberg in Return of the Jedi, and that would have been mad, wouldn't it? I can only imagine what that film would have been like then.
Yeah, that would have been really something to see.
But I don't know, it's because by that point everyone has such a grand view of him that you can't have that same community of ideas involved. So that he becomes the auteur by proxy almost, because everybody believes that that's his role now.
Well, yes, but
he
obviously
still decided
recognises
to be
the talent.
like, right, this is me.
Yeah, he obviously I know it was very difficult for him, like very challenging physically, emotionally, mentally, all of that to make Star Wars. But then he obviously recognises the input of an Irvin Kershner, and he goes out to Kershner and he says, I need you on this. And I mean, Kershner was quite late in his career. He wasn't a natural choice to be directing the sequel to the biggest film of all time. But George Lucas understood that, he liked him, he respected him, and he needed someone he knew would do a good job. So I don't understand the thought process that he went through where he didn't think the same, where he didn't say, look, I've spent the last 30 years thinking about episodes 1, 2, and 3, and I've got this outline, now I've been scripting it, and now I just need someone to make it for me in the way that Kershner and Mark 1 did it. Find that talent and, have them make something incredible while you're supervising all the production.
It's that you can't do everything by yourself, even though you want to sometimes. Like it feels like that's what burnt him out in the first film. He was trying to do so much single-handedly and then making sure that he could have careful craft over the vision. But yeah, it's a lot to try and do, and not many people can do it. Like there's only a very small handful of directors which can consistently do that, have the vision, direct it, write it, and then make something great almost every time.
Yeah. And I think George Lucas is one of those directors.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. But like we said, the film was a massive, massive success. Franchises, marketing, everything just seemed to work for it. But before we sort of end today's episode, we should also talk about our favourite moments from the original trilogy. What are the moments that stick in your head, Matt? What are the moments you consistently go back to? And they don't have to be the cliffhangery moments, anything that just you think of Star Wars and you're like, that's one of my favourites.
When I was a kid, the stuff that stuck in my head was the dog fights, the space fights, the X-Wings flying around. As I've got older and I kind of like lost interest in Star Wars, but periodically revisit these old films, the things that always stick out to me that I love are the little bits of dialogue, the little oddities of dialogue, like, I used to bust womp rats in my T16. Like, I just find like lines like that so funny because they are weird. They're weirdly written lines.
But they stick in your head, like you say. Like
they do really
those
stick
are the ones
in your head.
I remember.
I've altered the terms of the deal. Pray that I do not alter them any further. Like, I think that you can take the piss out of the dialogue, but as we've been watching a lot of this hammy space opera stuff, the cheesy dialogue is a big part of it. And it's all the stuff that like shouldn't be quotable, but is quotable. Like, I'm endangering the mission. I shouldn't have come.
Yeah. It's a trap.
It's a trap, yeah. And it's not all the stuff about the Force, which is like the big headline quotes, like, use the Force, may the Force be with you. That stuff's boring. I don't care about that.
It's not impossible. I used to bullseye womp rats in my T-16 back home. They're not much bigger than 2 meters. I'm endangering the mission. I shouldn't have come.
It's a trap! I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
One thing that I really noticed that I really loved in the first one, rewatching it for this, is that I think in my head I remember Darth Vader and James Earl Jones' performance as really low, steady, measured, and threatening. But in that first film, he's angry. He's really angry all the time. He's yelling at people, and he's really like worked up. And I always forget that that's how Darth Vader sounded first time round. He's not this just constantly talking in a deep, threatening voice. It is like, I'm going to kill all these blasted rebels. You know, it's like he's really
shaking his
up.
fist. That's what he's doing all the time, and then killing all his generals with like the Force.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's great. The way that is it Empire or Jedi? It's either the second or third one where like 4 people get promoted to admiral that just keep getting killed, generals, and then now they're an admiral because he's choked someone to death.
Oh, it's so good.
What are some of your favourite moments then?
I really like all of the stylized bits. Obviously, the speeders in Return of the Jedi really stick in my head just because I remember that moment and it just being so fast paced and being on the edge of my seat during that, because you think they're going to fly into a tree any moment. Just that one always sticks into my head. The carbonite moment and everything that happens in that.
Everything in that final act of The Empire Strikes Back looks stunning.
I mean, that's a given, isn't it?
So
that's
good.
just great. I think it's something about seeing the planets, like when you see the Jawas for the first time and you see them in the little hoods and they take R2-D2 and C-3PO. Moments like that, and just going to this weird cave and then Obi-Wan Kenobi just telling this story about what the Force is and all this kind of thing. Even weird little moments like the chess set that they're playing on the Millennium Falcon. Yeah, cool. Just anything like that was just as a little bit quirky and a little bit... It's telling you something about the world that they're in, but in a very sort of like... oh, it's just like this kind of way.
I do like that chess game now you mention it, because it feels like a very space opera element, just because it's a very understated moment of showiness and flashy special effects. We know that it's a showy, flashy film, you know, all the X-Wing dogfights, lightsabers, the Force, all of that, just to throw in a holographic chess game that does nothing for the plot, drives nothing forward, and it's only there for a minute or so, a little humorous moment with Chewie and R2-D2 and C-3PO. It's understated and showy at the same time, which is an unusual combination, but appropriate for Star Wars. Yeah, that is a good moment of space opera silliness, I guess.
And it's like that with all the background shots as well. Like we talked about the CGI bits, but any of the other shots, there's something going on in the background. There's like a little remote control robot running around the Death Star. There's little aliens in the background.
Yes, little Roomba.
There's like loads of little weird stuff just adding depth and colour to this world, which I think is what makes it so iconic.
Is there any stuff that you don't like now watching it as an adult?
It's hard to see those moments because it's just so rose tinted as well. I kind of think.
Sure, and you were introduced through Jedi and Ewoks, so you're predisposed to be okay with the Ewoks. I think the Ewoks get a lot of shit. I don't think they're that bad. I think they're fine. They're cute. They're fun. But I do think that there is some valid criticism in the Ewoks in general, because when we're first introduced to them and then they go and hang out with them in their village, that scene goes on for, I don't know, maybe between 10 and 20 minutes, but it feels like it goes on forever. And I think it is the first time in the trilogy where the momentum and excitement just plummets because the plot is just not moving forward. You know, it pays off because we have to turn the Ewoks into this kind of part of the rebellion, basically, and then, you know, they overcome the Empire with their sticks and stones, and that's important.
The Luke-Leia brother-sister relationship's revealed in that bit as well. It's that kind of, but it's kind of...
No, I think it's later. I'm talking about like when they're first captured by the Ewoks and C-3PO.
They
think he's a god,
and then they tell the story. And then, yeah. But again, I can see what you mean.
It just goes on forever and it just feels like nothing's happening. And doesn't it kind of end with Luke revealing
then he goes off. But that sticks into my head as well for nostalgia reasons, because I suddenly had a flashback when I watched it this time around. I had a pop-up book of Return of the Jedi. And you know the moment where C-3PO is floating around on the chair? That was one of the pop-up things you could move up. You could move C-3PO up in his chair and then float him around. So it's like, for me, that's probably why I bypassed that, because I'm like, it's just my pop-up book when I was a kid.
I had the Return of the Jedi SNES game. I didn't have I think I've played the first one. I haven't played the Empire SNES game, and I owned the Jedi SNES game, which is amazing. But there's no level where you sit around the campfire. You do get to play as Wicket. Wicket was the best character. He had this bow and arrow that just would kill every enemy. It was amazing. You can play the speed bike level through the woods. What a game.
I had the first Star Wars game on Sega Mega Drive, and I could never get past the first level. And you would fly around in like a sound speeder and go to like different places in Tatooine and things like that. It was really good fun, but I was really crap at it.
Oh, you should have got the Jedi game on SNES, mate. It was amazing.
But yeah, again, that speaks to the franchise element of it. And it's just, it's covered every single facet of popular culture you can think of, from games to books to TV to film. It's all over the place.
But that kept the franchise alive after Jedi, didn't it? There's nothing on screen there's nothing in the cinema between 1983 and 1990. Well, the re-releases in 97, but nothing new till 1999. So a lot of nothing, basically, but this huge expanded universe, and also video games, board games, toys based on the original trilogy. it's kept so alive in people's minds that people are just champing at the bit in 1999 for a prequel series.
I think it's also sticking in people's minds because there are so many rip-offs or films loosely inspired but are majorly inspired by Star Wars. Like, as space opera continues in cinema, a lot of kind of very obvious Star Wars films are made without the Star Wars label.
I mean, I remember that period of time. Let's talk about what came after and what the kind of legacy is and the rest of the franchise a little bit. I remember episode 1 coming out. I was a huge Star Wars fan as a kid. I was young enough in 1999 to be incredibly excited for episode 1, but I was also just old enough to be incredibly disappointed with episode 1. It was a big thing. My dad was excited to take me and my brother because he'd shown us the originals. And we all just kind of came out a bit like, oh, that wasn't very good, was it? And that's the point where I kind of dropped off, really. But I do understand why people stuck with it, and it captivated a new generation, and it's continued this enormous legacy. Have you got any kind of highlights from post Jedi, and where did you go with the franchise after the originals as a kid?
So I did watch the prequels. I don't think I saw all of them at the cinema because I think, like you, it did kind of trail off. Even though I still loved episode 1 when I watched it because there was so much hype about it, and I wasn't old enough to be a film critic like yourself at that point. So I was doing my usual.
I'm a film critic. I just know shit film when I see it.
Whereas I've had my the continuing mentality that I always have. Most films are all right. So I loved the spectacle of it. I didn't have any problem with it when I watched it, and yeah, as it went on, I kind of lost more. I think I watched the second one at the cinema, and I don't think I saw the third one at the cinema. I think I waited until that came out. I've enjoyed the latest franchise more when they've kind of redone it. But again, because it's harking back. The sequel trilogy is kind of harking back a bit more. But again, it went off the rails towards the end, and they could have done more interesting things with it. They've lost the stuff that made the first franchise so good. The mythology elements and doing something different every time and expanding on that universe. I think that's kind of been lost along the way because you're doing more of a paint by numbers recreation. You're not trying to expand it.
Yeah. The sequel trilogy is a paint by numbers recreation, and the prequel trilogy is this insane attempt to try and explain in detail every moment that happens in the original trilogy. So you've got these two very weird trilogies that just do not stand on their own at all and are completely cinematically transfixed with the original trilogy and do basically nothing original in either case. They're doing their things very differently from each other. The sequels are very different from the prequels, but they are quite hollow films that are desperately reaching for the original trilogy to fill a void of storytelling within them.
This is why I think Disney has got a better idea by revisiting certain aspects of the universe now in the TV series. So stuff like The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, and/or everything that's coming out of that, they're looking at different aspects of different characters and things like that, and just adding a different mythology. The Mandalorian mythology is something interesting and different. It's similar to the Jedi's, but it's different in a lot of ways, and they've got stuff like there's different rules that they live by. That is revitalizing it for me. That makes it more interesting.
And it's a good jumping on point for non-fans as well. For that reason, it's like it's not Jedi, it's Mandalorians. You don't necessarily need to know the rules here. You're going to get explained a new set of rules while still feeling like you're in the same fictional universe.
Yeah, and you're going to find out more about these characters and their past, and it's going to be, you've got longer to develop them.
But there's some interesting stuff in there as well for fans of the series. I thought that there was some stuff there going on with what's going on in the universe immediately after the destruction of the Empire that was more interesting than what the sequel trilogy did with the post-Empire world, which because in the sequel trilogy it's just like the Empire's back, it's called the First Order, and it's exactly the same, and the dynamic is exactly the same. But there are moments in The Mandalorian where it's about the breakdown of order, and not everyone's necessarily happy that the Empire's been been destroyed, not because they were part of the Empire, but because it's a different way of life and they've got to adjust, and the Outer Rim's all kind of in disarray. I found that stuff way more interesting as sequel ideas than anything in the sequel trilogy.
Yeah, and the fact that they've got all of these ideas for the Mandalorian stuff from this back catalogue of episodes from Star Wars Rebels, which created this, again, expanded on the universe with different stories and introduced different characters. So there's another generation of Star Wars viewers which have grown up with that, and that's how they've come to know the universe. They know extra bits about it, what happened during the Clone Wars and all this kind of extra layer of Star Wars mythology. So you can kind of explore the world through that, which is quite an interesting aspect of it. But I mean, they're always going to keep making Star Wars stuff. There's so much more you can do with it, but it's just, I don't think anything can quite recapture how good this original trilogy was and just the magic of it.
Yeah, I became very jaded with Star Wars as a franchise. I think there's been so many points where it could and should have ended, the first of which being in 1983. But I think I'm getting to a point now where I've accepted that it didn't end at any of those points, and it's never going to end, and it's always going to be revitalized. And having made your peace with that, it's easier to just sort of accept things as they come. I really didn't like the sequel trilogy. And then I was surprised by how much I like The Mandalorian. And I'll continue to dip in and out of it. And I think they're just going to keep making content. Some of it's going to be absolutely dreadful, and some of it is going to be like some of the best TV ever made. So I'm happy for them to continue with that. And I'm never going to go back to being like a huge fan. And I think I'll just be dipping in when they make something good.
But again, that goes back to what we often say about films. We're big fans of independent cinema, and this whole project started from an independent filmmaker, found a production company, got a film which was supposed to be smaller than the sum of its parts, became massive, and it just all spiraled from there. And then that's how we got Star Wars. And I think that's a beautiful success story. And it's just has shaped science fiction in ways that you never would have seen coming beforehand.
So I guess long may its legacy reign, I think, is what we're saying, right?
Yes, I would definitely say so. And I mean, I'm sure we will revisit Star Wars at some point, whether here or on the Patreon feed. There's many more conversations to be had about the Star Wars universe, I feel.
Absolutely. Well, the conversation is not quite ending about Star Wars, is it? Because next time on the show, we are going to be looking at some of those films that came in the wake of Star Wars that you were talking about before, and dealing with the kind of post-Star Wars space opera slump. So what films have we got next time for that, James?
So next time on the podcast, we are going to be looking at Star Crash from 1978 and Battle Beyond the Stars from 1980, which share a lot of their DNA with Star Wars.
We'll be looking at what that kind of cinematic landscape looked like immediately in the aftermath, and what people were trying to do to catch up with George Lucas.
Yes, so please join us for that. It will be another exciting adventure in our space opera odyssey.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Journey Through Sci-Fi.
You can find us at journeythroughsci-fi.com, where you can find links to our social media and join the conversation.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard and want to support us, why not leave us a review on your podcast app of choice? It really helps new people find the show.
You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi, where you can receive exclusive bonus episodes every month.
Don't forget to subscribe to the show, and we'll see you again next time for another Journey Through Sci-Fi.